In this video, I'm going to be explaining the role that the concept of ideology plays in outlining how media are related to political power. And I'm going to be doing that in relation to the work of John Corner and John Corner's 2016 article on the place of ideology in media studies. In many ways, that's quite a difficult piece of work to read because it's kind of like stumbling into the middle of a conversation. It assumes a lot of knowledge, but it's also a useful orientation point that gives us an indication of where the study of ideology belongs in media research and in understanding how media play an active part in creating social reality. And I suppose to cut to the chase, of course, I should warn you that the concept of ideology is fantastically complicated and has been something which has been widely debated and been the topic of wild disagreements over the last, a couple of hundred years, but certainly the last 60 years or so of media and cultural studies. But nevertheless, I think there are a few basic points that we can rescue from it, and this is one of the things that Corner does in his article. And I suppose the main point that we would have is that in the contemporary world, and in fact in the world of public politics as we've understood it over the last couple of hundred years, the key skill in politics has been the ability to take a particular set of ideas that interest a particular set of people, and taking those ideas and making them popular amongst other groups of people, and making them so popular that they appear to be nothing but common sense. So ideology describes a process through which politicians or political interests use language to take a very particular set of political arguments and make them appear to be common sense. And that's related to media and media history because media becomes central to that process. And that is what John Corner is doing in his article. He's explaining how that idea has worked its way into media research through various different kinds of incarnations. So what I'm going to be doing really is using Corner's article as a guide to the development of ideological thinking in studies of media and power and the relationship between media industries and the changing nature of political power. And I'm going to be finishing up with an example of how we can use these ideas to understand what's at stake in a current case study. And I'm going to be talking about communications around hoarding during the COVID-19 crisis in Australia. And I'm going to be using that to explore a kind of a key idea behind ideological research, which is the idea that media communication doesn't just perform an explicit function. It doesn't just inform us or entertain us or whatever. That quite often media communication works because it shares a set of unstated, implicit ideas that really affect the way that we understand reality. And I'm going to be exploring kind of how that can be, those ideas can be used to make sense of why recent communications around COVID-19 are in Australia are important. Now, I was really thrilled recently when a student asked me about Louis Althusser and Louis Althusser's work on ideology. And Louis Althusser is an important figure whose work was influential in how we understand media power. And he was influential in the sense that he put forward the argument that that reality is significantly built through language and through the way that we describe the world, and that we can never get outside of the power of language in the way that we understand the world. We can only ever understand the world through language, and therefore the way that we use language ideologically has an important role to play in making reality. And one of the famous quotes from Althusser's writing on ideology, and particularly his essay on the ideological state apparatus, is ideologies have histories, but ideology has no history. And you kind of look at that and go, what? Well, what Althusser meant by this is that particular ideology, so particular political points of view, they have histories. And what that means is they have origins that we can trace in the thoughts of particular people and the goals that they had. So we can talk about Marxist ideology, we can talk about liberal ideology, and we can talk about these as political ideas whose history we can trace. We can find out more or less where they started and how they developed. But ideology has no history. And what Althusser meant by this is that that no matter where we are, the idea that reality is strongly affected by how we create stories about how reality works, how we take the physical environment of the world in which we live and try and make sense of it through particular uses of language. That particular process is something that runs through history, and is something that we're never actually outside of. We're always bound up to the values that shape our particular culture. So the reason why that's important is it explains how language plays a formative function in creating reality. What Althusser was really saying is that the only reality that really counts for anything is the one that we can experience through language. So there's a physical world out there and things happen in that world, but our understanding of why they happen in that world and what we should do about that physical environment is determined by the way that we make sense of it through language. And that becomes really important because obviously media are a central source of those ideas and explanations. Now, one of the reasons why the corner reading is really important is because he very generously points to the work of Stuart Hall as a key moment that really kind of brings the notion of ideology into media studies and teaches us all how to use ideology to explain how popular culture in particular starts to have political effects, how popular culture starts to have important impacts on the way that we understand reality. And what Hall talks about is how popular culture becomes a source of what he calls common sense, a source of everyday knowledge which appears to be widely shared, widely understood, widely unaccepted, and for that reason is accepted largely as a matter of fact. I'm going to be talking about an example of how we can see this in play very, very soon. But the reason why Hall is particularly relevant is that ideology becomes important to media research through three figures, all of which Hall is largely responsible for importing into media studies. And these three figures are Karl Marx, Louis Althusser, and an Italian Marxist called Antonio Gramsci. And Gramsci is connected with the notion of hegemony. And what the journey that Hall traces is as follows. So under classical Marxism, ideology was defined as false consciousness. Ideology was a particular way of looking at the world that reflected the interests of capitalism. So what Marx was suggesting was that the way that people use language and make sense of the world through language and through art and those sorts of things is ultimately determined by the economic relationships that ground that society. So basically, art and culture and language are expressions of the dominant relations that structure the economic base. And the significant impact of first Althusser and then Gramsci is that they introduced the idea that language and communication is more important than that. Language and communication isn't something that simply represents the values of the powerful. It's actually something that actively constructs those values in the first place. So through taking the Marxist original idea that language tells us something about power relations in society, Hall uses Gramsci and Althusser to argue that media become an important source for the ideas that we use to make sense of reality, and become an important way of taking very political ideas that favour certain groups over others and turning them into common sense. And increasingly, this begins to happen through not information campaigns, not through politics, but through popular culture. The real innovation of Hall was that he argued that popular culture is encoded and soaked in all of these values that we rarely reflect upon, and in that sense it's ideological. Now here's an example of how all of that works with regard to coronavirus. So one of the things that the notion of ideology allows us to do is explain how media communication is about far more than simple entertainment or the simple transmission of information. It's also about actively constructing a real social world by building and naturalizing particular worldviews. And we can see this distinction between the kind of common sense view of media and communication as something which is simply about information, simply about entertainment, and the underlying view that beneath what the manifest content, the explicit message of a particular communication is, there's a set of implicit assumptions that are really important on a political basis. And we can see this in contemporary debates around hoarding in Australia. So we've all seen recently, there have been a lot of stories about the importance that people don't go out and buy as many toilet rolls as they possibly can, because this is disrupting the supply chain, and this is basically creating conditions of dearth. This is actually creating a crisis where nothing is needed. So the idea is don't hoard. But we also know that there's something far more at stake here. The message isn't simply that hoarding is a bad idea. It's also that hoarding is un-Australian. That to go out and binge buy things and hoard them because you're worried that you might run out and you don't really care about your fellow citizen is somehow unbecoming for anyone who calls themselves Australian. So what we see here is that we can see how communications around COVID-19 are both information but also ideological. They draw their appeal not only on the information they spread, but also through the ideas that they activate, through the way that they get us to change our behaviours by drawing on a particular valued understanding of what being Australia, of what it means to be an Australian. And of course, one of the reasons why this is also ideological is that in these behaviours, we see people being very uneasy because a narrative of Australian national identity, which has been over 100 years in the making, is somehow unravelling. And that is going to change the nature of Australian society by changing the way that Australian society sees itself. So what I've done here is I've explained in a very brief fashion how the reason why the notion of ideology is important to understanding media power, and also how we can use the idea to explain how there's more going on than first meets the eye in current communications around COVID-19.